In lesson 12 of Pathways to Creativity, I talk about embracing the abstract. And like the previous lesson, I talk about how now I'm taking abstract expressionists and exploring what motivated them to do the work that they were doing. And I start to photograph the way they were painting until it became my own visual language as well. Embracing the abstract has become one of the hallmarks of my work, and I think you will find this interesting and illuminating. Pathways to Creativity, lesson number 12, embracing the abstract. This is one of my favorite photos, and the reason it's one of my favorites is that it was so intentional. I did it and created it to make money. And in fact, it has made money. And occasionally as a photographer, you have to make money. And it's got an interesting story, but I'm not going to get into it now. But what I want to say about it is it's extremely obvious what it is. A beautiful white horse with its mane flying in the air. But another way of talking about it is it's objective. It's recognizable. Where we're about to head is into the non-objective, the abstract world of art, and creating it and embracing it. And abstract expressionism was a way of creating art that would allow people who viewed the art to tap into their own imagination. Where I left off in the previous lecture was talking about how I started working, following masters and creating photographic representations that were inspired by the works of other artists until it then became part of my own visual vocabulary. And I'm picking up where I left. And I am doing that in the world of abstract expressionism because quite simply, I didn't get it when I was in college. You know, I looked at this work and it didn't affect me. Whereas an Andrew Wyeth, I could understand. But in this abstract expressionism, I was simply not ready for it. I wasn't perhaps mature enough. Not that I am today, but yeah, you get it. And so I started photographing things that reminded me a little bit of the minimalist art of Frank Stella. Corrugated metal fencing, for instance. Late afternoon, the orange and the blue are complementary colors. All those things kind of I've talked about before. But in fact, I started shooting this because of Frank Stella and trying to understand the brain behind the art. Whenever I go to New York, as I've stated before, I always work in a couple hours at the Museum of Modern Art just to see what they've got up in their galleries. And on one occasion, there was this huge painting by Barnett Newman. Just beautiful, vast red canvas with a white stripe. There's a couple other stripes, but the white one is the predominant one. All right, so I look at it, I photograph these people, and then I move on. And I come back 20 minutes later, and people are still there staring. I have to admit, I don't have quite that result. But I do have a pretty good memory for works of art, especially if I've photographed them. And a couple of months later, I was in Hamburg, Germany, where I had a large outdoor exhibit, and the mayor was there. And the following day, he presented me with a tour of Hamburg Harbor on a Zodiac. So I went there, and I photographed this on that tour of Hamburg Harbor. So that's Barnett Newman, and this is what I photographed. Now, what I really photographed was this, which was the bottom of a freighter. But after I've played with contrast and saturation, I created that, which resembled that. And so, again, I'm looking at these works of art, these really highly regarded works of art. I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to replicate it. And at a certain point, then as I go forward, I start shooting naturally things that are of that same vein. I'm expanding my visual vocabulary, in other words. Mark Rothko, another very famous abstract expressionist, painted paintings that he would call or refer to as landscapes. And the soft lines between the color he referred to as horizons or water. And as I look at his work, I think, okay, I can find things like that, these really abstract landscapes, and I can somewhat get into the fact that they could be construed as landscapes. And of course, he often used complementary colors as he painted his paintings. So in an old oil drum, painted with bands of color, I zoom in to where you can't even perceive the curvature of the drum or even the fact that it's a metal drum. To you, it looks somewhat like a Mark Rothko. This particle board on a construction site in Manhattan. And obviously, over time, somebody wrote some obscene words and somebody officiously came by and painted over it until we got something akin to a Mark Rothko. But this is where it gets interesting. I'm up on the Crescent City, Northern California coast, shooting a sunset. And I shoot it in a vein that reminds me of a Mark Rothko. Bands of color. Very unlike what I would have shot in previous years. Venice Beach, California is a Rothko-inspired composition. Until I start shooting that way naturally, I'm increasing my vision, adding to my arsenal of compositions, and it started with trying to replicate or pay homage to a previous artist. In fact, that's the way I believe we humans evolve cultures. We're inspired by something, we take it into our own evolutionary journey. So much so that when I'm flying from a little town in Germany up to Norway, I look out at 40,000 feet and I shoot a very minimalist landscape that is just bands of color. Or at an infinity pool in Cabo San Lucas. Or of a landscape in Botswana. It becomes a new vision. Pierre Mondrian was an artist that fled Europe ahead of World War II. He came to New York. He loved stained glass. His friends, the people he hung out with, were largely architects. And the work that he created, he would say, belongs within the architecture that they were found. And it's unequivocal that you can see the stained glass influence in his paintings. Classic Mondrian. And so, these plastic carts full of fish on a dock in Morocco suddenly remind me of a Mondrian. As does this building in India or this hotel in Manhattan. Things that remind me of artists that I've seen. So it starts with chimping. It starts with trying to replicate their work until it becomes part of your own vision. This dry dock in Hamburg Harbor and this wall that was obviously a practice place where you could test the color of paint that would go on boats in the dry dock becomes a Mondrian. Jasper Johns was a pop artist who used, and he's still around, so I shouldn't say was. He's in his 90s, he's still creating. Just classic circles and circles. Classic Jasper Johns. Or is it? No. So if you have the ability to look at things that are familiar to us and somehow detach the reality of being a mobile sign, which is now defunct anyways, but if you can look at that sign and see, triangles, circles, rectangles, and start to mine it for what it is, the world opens up. If forever and a day you only see it as a mobile sign, you're not there yet. But if you can visualize cropping somewhere into a rectangle that has triangles, then you can create something different than what you're looking at. Kazimir Malevich was a Russian impressionist, earlier than the American expressionists. Did I call him an impressionist? No, he was an abstract expressionist that lived in Petersburg, Russia. The height of his career was in the mid 1900s. No, not the mid 1900s, the early 1900s. Height of his career probably was around 1917, 18. He called this plane taking off. Okay, well, other critics or people that review his work said that his work defied gravity. And you can see that. Nothing in this painting is touching the edges. Okay, defying gravity. Here's another one of Malevich's work. He also created a series on these rectangles that had texture within. And he referred to these as abstract landscapes. So I can see that the texture within these squares could imply the texture of a land. Okay. This one more so. And I was about to embark on a trip to Thailand and India and Cambodia. And I thought, all right, I'm going to go and look for Kazimir Malevich's type of squares. I always love departing Seattle with an agenda. So I'm walking through these cities, looking for subjects that inspire me, and I'm looking for, more importantly, rectangles or squares that had texture within. Okay, you can see it. You can see that. And a lot of these were posters that had been put up on a wall, and then through time and destruction, they left the building, and the residue of the glue that held them to the wall remained. And so you got patterns. That becomes a piece of art right there. Different rectangles as I traveled through these cities and back alleys. Okay, an old electrical box. Looks like something different. It looks like little voodoo dolls. But now I'm on the hunt. Now I'm seeing things and considering things I would never have done in the past. The world's opening up. So people tell me, you ought to go to that East LA. There's fantastic, huge murals all over the place. And it's like, no, that's not what I'm after. I'm not there to photograph somebody's works of art. I would never, in other words, photograph that. That is somebody else. Not that I would even want to photograph that, but if I photograph that, that's somebody else's copyright and creation. This, on the other hand, is unintentional because whoever did that, that put blue, they never met each other. This is layering of time and wear and distance. And whatever I frame within that then becomes my own copyright, but not that. So that becomes my own composition. Somebody else created it, I framed it and saw it. So in the back alleys, under the freeways, in the marginal zones of most cities, where the disenfranchised, the homeless live, there are discarded environments. And if I can find something in the decay and the abandoned and frame it, that's a great metaphor for finding beauty in decay. Birth and renewal. So if you look at this, and this may not be your cup of tea, but look at this. This is a support for a freeway, in Johannesburg, South Africa. Cement supports each had a number. And fortunately, this one was blue and red, so it's a little bit of color. Whoever scratched into the cement with a knife or something else, left their own chicken scratch. There's 4 or 5 posters that were put up and the glue remained. The posters are gone. Somebody put that up. Somebody made that dark mark. And the collective then, if I frame it, is my own composition. All right, you still might say, so what? Let me go on. So traveling through the discarded neighborhoods of cities, and I have to say Havana is one perfect city for this, because the poverty of Cuba and the extent of the city, there's a lot of discarded old buildings. And just the humidity of the Caribbean and all of those things lead to a bunch of things that I can mine. So I walk through these neighborhoods, and it's filled with people on the street playing soccer. There's a vibe down in Cuba that's quite intoxicating from my point of view. And I've been there starting 20 years ago. I lived down there for a couple, 2 weeks, and I never felt endangered. It just never happened. But in those back streets of Havana or Delhi or Johannesburg or Addis Ababa or Detroit, Michigan, or there are areas where it's unkempt, that you can find and look and mine for the beauty of what most people would never see. You go in the back alleys of old Delhi where tourists never go, and people won't have eye contact with you, but you clearly are out of place. And I'm walking down, I've got my Arc'teryx jacket, I've got a brand new camera, I'm just cruising, and nobody asks me, are you lost? They just won't have eye contact with you, but they're observing you. If you whip your head around really fast, you can see they're staring at you. But if you have eye contact, they'll avert their eyes. Kind of like that. And I start to look at greasy walls or chipped paint, and I start to photograph. It's not that. That's another thing I could photograph. Workers, which I probably will. In fact, I did. But it's this that I'm after. I'm looking at these things, and again, with the nod towards some of the most famous abstract expressionists, I start to see things that remind me of their work. And if I spend a couple minutes framing this with my tripod and bending down and shooting that, and I get up and I walk away around a corner and I peek back and there's 5 or 6 people staring at what I just shot, scratching their head, shaking their head, wondering what the hell did this guy see? I love that. So as I move through and as I do this more and more, the work is getting better and more nuanced. And you can imagine this image here, printed on a really fine paper, mounted on a substrate of plastic or metal, and it could hang in the foyer of any modern office. And nobody would refute that's a piece of art. It's so, it's like taking handcuffs off. I'm allowing myself to make mistakes, to shoot things that wouldn't go anywhere, but I'm also finding and shooting things that are uniquely mine. And in the age of flash mobs that are following on Instagram, every shot that's shot and suddenly the following day there's a bunch of people shooting the same stuff, it's really quite nice to shoot your own compositions that nobody else has done in the history of mankind. Nobody's shot it quite like that. We live at a time where I can look at photos of my mountains that I shot down in Patagonia 25 years ago, and I can see somebody that shot one last year, and sometimes I can't tell mine from theirs. It's a little disheartening. So yes, in the decay of these cities, if I frame it, whatever's within that rectangle of my composition has to stand on its own merits. I'm taking it out of context. This larger shot, you're perceiving that you're looking up under an overhang of some structure. But once I frame it and take perspective away, it is reliant on its own composition. I teach classes in Astoria and soon to be Port Townsend. Next year, Detroit. And we'll go into this discarded buildings. And again, you forget about the urine smells, the mold, the mildew. You're looking for art. And whatever you frame is reliant on its own compositions. And the old cement bunkers constructed during World War II, looking for Japanese subs in both Washington and Oregon, these structures are still there as a remnant historical site. And inside, cement starts to take on its own patina and texture and layering. And people will come in, spray paint, bad signs, and officious park personnel will come and paint over it. And with time, the layering creates the art. And again, if this was framed and put up in a museum of modern art, people would sit and stare at it and imagine something different. In an old barge along the Amazon in Manaus, Brazil, the metal gets rusted, becomes textured. The tires that are on the dock that separate the barge from the dock create their own patterns. Down the barge, there's steps, a ladder where you can see the scuff marks of boots as people are climbing. So you start to look at these things, and they've got a history, and they're telling a story. Outside of Seattle, there's this old container that was made out of metal. And obviously, over its history, things were loaded within that bent and compromised the metal structure. And so then rust ensued. So photographing it like this tells the story of what it is. If I go to the left and shoot straight on, it becomes a Japanese frieze. It becomes a composition. And when I get into Lightroom after I've shot the shot, I can play with saturation and colors, orange and blue, change it to a lighter orange and blue, or even red and green. Because it looks like bamboo to me. Even the metal supports look like the joints in a bamboo trunk. So it's got that organic feel to it. It's abstract, and it's not unlike the other expressionist work of the last century, where you look at this and you can imagine your own subject, tapping into the subconscious minds of the people that ultimately view this image. Walking down Manhattan Street, store has been closed, paper has been put up so nobody can see what lies within, and with moisture and humidity, the paper gets stained. And in those stains are cumulus clouds and abstraction. And the minute I stopped and really got into shooting this, other people would stop, pull out their iPhones, and start shooting it. It's a curious thing about humans. They wouldn't care or see this as a subject until somebody like me is paying attention and shooting it. And it's beautiful. It's the delicacy of the lines, the difference between a very fine line and a thicker line, the organic nature and the unintentional creation made by nature, moisture and paper. I love this. I love finding this. I love shooting it. And I love the abstraction of it. So the sun is relentless on paper and plastic. It breaks things down with time. And the fracturing of plastic and paper and paint creates something that I discover in film. This again looks like bamboo. It's on the edge of a container. And the sun in Israel is relentless, and it fractures it, and it looks like bamboo, dried bamboo leaves to me. And every piece, every square foot of this wall was filled with fractures that were big and small and color. I'm just having a ball, and people are driving by looking at me going, must be an American. So yeah, I'm looking at degraded environments. I'm looking at old posters that have degraded to the point where what's ever on that poster becomes something that I frame, because this was never intended to look like this when it was put up, but it's a face peering out. I am shooting without prejudice. If it intrigues me, I'll shoot it. And as I grow and mature as a photographer, and more importantly, as an observer, the world is opening up. On a monastery outside of a town in Laos, little Polaroids adorn the door. And as they break down with the humidity and the rain, they become something different than what was intended. And then I move in and photograph it, because it's like a historical document. But more importantly, I'm just not recording or capturing something that was identical to when it was put up. It becomes my own. Outside of bars in any city in Europe or America, posters were put up promoting the next band that's coming along, and people tear away those posters, and the collective then becomes abstract art. But in the painter's world, it would be called collages. And collages can be found from Seattle to New York, Paris to Berlin. And you can see now how it starts to look like abstract expressionism. And I love this, because again, when I framed it just like this, I guarantee you nobody photographed this image like this ever before. And it's everywhere. In Asia, India, Africa. And what's also interesting and intriguing to me as I embarked on this journey was watching and looking how the human animal needs to leave something behind to make their chicken scratch, as we call it, but their name. They carve into walls, on bar stools, on bars. This is actually on the bar surface of a famous bar in Havana that served mojitos or some drink. Whatever the drink is made out of rum. Anyway, but look at the collective. Everybody feels a need. And that then becomes a collection. As I travel, I see it everywhere on the planet, that people just have this need to scratch their name, leave a trace. And it becomes beautiful to me. The human hand made all those marks, but not one, a multitude of people passing by. It becomes a historical document, because if this was 2,000 years old, there would be a plaque below it, not unlike the way we look at petroglyphs and pictographs of a different era. On a window in an abandoned mining town in Namibia, same thing. So that becomes a story. Incidental collaborations. And as I look at the chicken scratches of people writing their name or making a love circle or a heart circle, I also tune into the intentional lines, framing of people passing by, and with time, the overlapping marks of somebody, painting over a "fuck you" sign suddenly becomes a beautiful piece of art that I discover. So yeah, I'm looking at all things that I could construe as abstract. I'm looking at lines and patterns and framing them in a way that becomes my own. And if I want to imagine this dark mark with these ears as a devil or something else, it becomes something that taps into the subconscious. The hunt, going into these discarded environments and finding beauty in the decay. I can't wait to get on the road again and do this again. And when I teach the workshops, it's very liberating for people because we go into these environments, we photograph. I have to pull people away after several hours. And then we critique and then we go out again. And as in the past, I'll always say the things I initially look for are lines, patterns, and textures. And again, what I would have said in an earlier lecture about moving the eye through and filling the frame still applies, whether it's a landscape or an abstract. This is a classic Jackson Pollock, one of the most famous abstract expressionists. He would throw paint on a canvas on the floor. He would create these compositions that are amazingly balanced. Balanced meaning your eye just navigates throughout the entire complexity of this frame. And then he wants you to imagine what you're looking at. Very organic in nature, huge paintings. And I've seen people stare and study and look for, 20 minutes, where I couldn't do that with the Barnett Red painting. I could do that here. Because when I look at these paintings, I imagine lichens and complexity of forests. I see nature. Even the color scheme is reminiscent of lichens and mosses. He referred to his painting style as automaticism, meaning he would subconsciously put his mind off center and just throw the paint and be guided by his subconscious. And the end result then was a very balanced, very in-depth type of creation. The variance of color and line created the depth. Classic Jackson Pollock. Classic, nope. This is the side of a freight truck on a freeway from San Jose down to Monterey. And I shot this outside of a open car window at 50 miles an hour on a freeway. But it's Jackson Pollock. All those scratches on the edge of that truck tells you it's a very old truck that's been used and used and used. But in my mind, it was a Jackson Pollock. The back of a flatbed pickup truck in Chinatown, Bangkok. That's the way I photographed it. But as I looked at these scratches, I knew I'd frame it into a rectangle, play with contrast, and create this, which becomes a Jackson Pollock. On a door in an Inuit village up in Greenland, a husky dog scratches the door to be let in, and his scratch marks create a Jackson Pollock. Mud-spattered vehicle in Australia, no, Jackson Pollock. So there's a whole afternoon right there in that old truck in Chinatown, Bangkok, to be scrutinized and gone over, and whatever I frame, if it works out, it becomes a piece of art. Outside of Atlanta, there's 1,000 old cars just being consumed by the nature. It's kind of creepy, actually, because some people have put old dolls in these cars, and it's just like a little edgy for me. But as I walked through, I was able to open one of the doors. Most of them are rusted shut. I was able to get into this car and look, and I saw some lines down in here. So I put my camera here and used a autofocus on a 24-70. I couldn't even get my head behind the camera because the slope of the windshield The slope of that wouldn't get my fat head behind the viewfinder, but I was reliant on autofocus and aligning the lens with the slope of the glass. And so I'm getting in there now. This is the last shot before I couldn't get my head behind the camera, but this is what I shot. So I don't know what the glass is. The glass at that era would have had some sort of oils, I guess, in it. And as it degraded and broke down, these fantastical shapes like amoebas are there. I don't think anybody's ever seen that on this car. And that's not really as important as finding a subject, framing it, and having great fun doing that. But it's very organic. And shifting left or right, there was a yellow car reflecting in the sun, and that gave this whole flavor of this shot a little bit of a yellow patina. That does look like an organic animal. There's an artist by the name of Mark Tobey that was friends with Jackson Pollock, and very much in the vein of Jackson Pollock. But rather than throwing paint, he created, precise lines with a brush. And I look at some of the lines in fruit orchards in Eastern Washington in winter months, and I see some of the lines. And if I see something that reminds me of the type of lines that Mark Tobey used, then I'm going to shoot it. And a beautiful abstract panoramic. In those fruit orchards where they prune trees to bend down low so they can grab the fruit, all these contorted trunks create a beautiful pattern. Alder trees in winter are really a study of line, almost like scratches of a painting, inspired by Mark Tobey and Jackson Pollock. There's no leading lines, horizons. It's all about the abstraction of these trees or of these grasses at great elevation of around 14,000 feet in the Bolivian Andes. Would I have ever shot grass like this without studying abstract expressionism? No, I wouldn't even have seen it. I would have been looking for the animals that moved across the plain. But I'm seeing them and I'm shooting it now. And these are the lichens and the mosses of oak trees in California. So you see where I'm going. I'm shooting trees in a very different way than what I historically would be doing because I studied abstract expressionism. But uniform and balanced and abstract. A hillside in Greenland becomes an abstract landscape. And I start looking at other things like abalone shells and moving in close and creating abstract expressionism. So both nature and man-made structures are an even playing field. And whether you know scale or what the subject was is irrelevant. You look at it and it has to be reliant on its own merits. And patterns and textures are very much part of the whole journey. And basically by doing this then, you become a keener observer. You start to look at everything you pass by. An old dumpster becomes something worthy of scrutiny. An old box, broken paint, fractured walls, an old car where the paint is just shriveling and cracking, a fire-ravaged wall. And I'm looking and expanding. I get into places where there's reflections in harbors, Old Boat Harbor down in Astoria, and on the right conditions where the wind and the subject work together, and with a small aperture opening, depth of field is critical. You create beautiful abstract compositions within the water and metaphors, things that look like other things. So it's a great journey. I first started off right out of college trying to replicate, pay homage to the works of Claude Monet, Renoir, Seurat, and now abstract expressionism. And who knows what the future lies. But I know one thing. I'm relentless in experimenting and looking and keeping my imagination open. Last year I was down, or the year before last now, I was down in the Dead Sea. And in the Dead Sea, there's beautiful patterns below the surface in the clay and the mud. So photography is very much the art of observing. The keener the eye, the more the subjects involve you, reveal themselves. That's the word. When I look at this fractured wall shot in Havana, I start to imagine shoulders and heads, head shapes. Yeah, they're there. It's like there's people here. In an old log on the beach, there's the huddled, quiet masses. Am I smoking dope? No, I'm being honest. I'm seeing human figures in walls, ceilings. I can imagine it, I see it. A kid playing soccer on an old oil drum. On the outskirts of Astoria, there's this old railroad car. It's fractured with time. I'm hoping they never throw it away because I take my class here and we're photographing the fractures. But if you look at this and you study it, yeah, there's fractures, there's color, and then you start to see an eye, an eyebrow, a mouth, a big jutting chin. There's a face right there. In this shot, I framed this, and suddenly a face came out. So studying and looking and imagining and being playful, you start to see faces, frightening faces, faces in the logs. So we call these metaphors, things that look like something else. That's a fish. You can see the fish eye. That's one of those dogs that have short legs, kind of a grumpy mouth. I see a blue rabbit. So having the imagination, having fun looking, it's all part of the journey. Whether this ever became a serious piece of art or not is less important than the fact that I saw it and I shot it. This is a sperm whale. When I was studying art history, the Chinese masters painted pictures that I thought revealed the fact that they smoked a lot of opium, because they were creating mountain ranges that surely was different than anything I've seen, and I think totally created by their own imagination. Then I went to Huangshan and I realized what they were painting was much more literal, that there were in fact mountain ranges that looked as they painted. But I never stopped there, because I start seeing those karst limestone landscapes everywhere I go. This will become a book someday, Imaginary Landscapes. At a time where every mountain on the planet has been well documented, creating your own mountain ranges out of things that people walk by every day, the great buttes of the Southwest. Wouldn't that be refreshing, seeing a landscape book created from the imagination? Mountains that haven't been photographed before. I could see haiku, I could see poetry, I could see my own writing in this book. A book of landscapes that nobody has shot. That's worth the journey. Suns and moons. So imaginary landscapes. The Palouse of Eastern Washington. So never stop imagining, looking, questioning. If you have a great imagination, you're really on the right path. You see mountains and volcanoes all waiting out there. You don't have to fly to India or Africa. You can find this in your own community, your own city. You can find Angel Falls on that alley down the street. So teaching and learning together, discovering things that people would never see, that is worth embracing. The sun setting over a distant ridge. Clouds building up on a distant mountain. Yeah, am I smoking dope? No. I have, but yeah, it doesn't do anything for me. I'm a tequila kind of guy. But you can see this work would be worthy of your own vision. On that chipped wall in Old Delhi, I can see it. This young man is painting Christian paintings in the Lalibela area of Ethiopia. And after he painted that and showed me it, I looked at the table below and I asked if I could photograph that. And of course he said yes. Unintentional, but beautiful nonetheless. A tuk-tuk in Bangkok took me from one location to the other. And then I told the driver, can you wait? I'll give you the money. Wait, I have to run up to my room, grab my camera. He waited because I gave him some money. Came down and photographed the floor of this tuk-tuk. Of course, he thought I was nuts. But the color was so beautiful. So I hope you got something out of this lecture. Thank you.